I never imagined that a man like the Duke of Ashford would notice someone like me, much less speak the words that would bind our fates together in the shadows. But he did. And the moment he asked me to become his wife in the stillness of his library, with no witness but the firelight and the silent rows of leather books, I understood that some promises are made to be kept hidden, and some loves are born to live in secret. My name is Clara Whitmore, though that is not the name I carried into this world. I was christened something else entirely, in a place I have spent 6 years trying to forget, and the careful construction of my new self has been the only act of artistry I have ever achieved. I came to Ashford Hall as a governess to Lady Constance, the Duke's young niece, a position I secured through forged references and a borrowed history. I told them I was the daughter of a country vicar, educated in a modest school for gentlewomen, recently bereaved and seeking respectable employment. They believed me because I spoke softly, kept my eyes lowered, and never asked for more than I was given. The Duke himself was a figure I rarely saw in those first months. He moved through the halls of his estate like a shadow, always dressed in black or deepest gray, his face set in lines of permanent severity. The servants whispered that he had loved once, in his youth, and that the woman had died under circumstances he would never discuss. They said it had changed him, turned him cold and remote, a man who fulfilled his duties to his title and his family, but gave nothing of his heart. I did not think of him except to step aside when he passed, to curtsy when he entered a room, to make myself as invisible as the wallpaper and the dust. But he saw me. Somehow, in all my careful invisibility, he saw me. It began on a November evening when the fog rolled in from the Thames and wrapped itself around the great house like a shroud. Lady Constance had taken ill with a fever, and I sat by her bedside through the long hours, reading to her from a book of fairy tales, pressing cool cloths to her forehead, singing the old lullabies my mother had sung to me before everything fell apart. The Duke came to check on his niece near midnight, and he found me there, in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, my hair falling loose from its pins, my dress rumpled, my voice hoarse from reading. He stood in the doorway for a long moment watching me, and when I finally noticed him and rose to curtsy, he raised one hand to stop me. "She is resting easier," I whispered, conscious of the impropriety of being alone with him in the quiet dark. "The fever has broken." He nodded slowly, his gray eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "You have been with her all evening," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace. She was frightened. I did not wish to leave her." He stepped into the room, moving with that silent grace that always surprised me in a man of his height and build. He looked down at his niece, at her small face peaceful in sleep, and something softened in his expression. Then he looked back at me. "You care for her," he said quietly. "Truly care for her. Not as a servant performing a duty, but as one who loves her." I felt a tightness in my throat. "I do," I said. "She is a dear child." He studied me for another long moment, and I had the unsettling sense that he was seeing past the careful mask I wore, past the borrowed name and the invented history, down to the truth I kept locked away. Then he nodded once more and left the room without another word. But something had shifted between us. In the days that followed, I became aware of his presence in ways I had not been before. I would feel his gaze on me across the drawing room when I brought Lady Constance down for her afternoon lessons. I would turn a corner in the hallway and find him there, as if he had been waiting. He began to ask me questions, small things at first, about my upbringing, my education, my thoughts on literature and music and the natural world. I answered carefully, always mindful of the fiction I had constructed, but I found myself drawn into conversations that lasted longer than propriety allowed, that ventured into territories of philosophy and feeling that no employer should explore with a governess. He was not like other men I had known. There was no false charm in him, No easy flattery. He spoke with precision and listened with complete attention. When he disagreed with me, he did so respectfully, as if my opinion mattered. When I made him smile, which was rare, it felt like a victory. I began to live for those moments, those stolen conversations in the library or the music room, those instances when the severe Duke of Ashford became simply a man, thoughtful and complicated and achingly lonely. I knew it was dangerous. I knew I was allowing myself to feel things I had no right to feel, to hope for things that could never be. A governess does not dream of dukes. A woman living under a false name does not imagine a future with a man who could destroy her with a single question, a single investigation into her past. But the heart doesn't obey the rules of reason, and mine had begun to betray me. It was a cold evening in late December when he asked me to join him in the library after Lady Constance had gone to bed. I went, though I knew I should not, though every instinct warned me that something had changed in the way he looked at me, in the tension that had been building between us for weeks. The fire was burning low when I entered, and he stood before it, his hands clasped behind his back, his profile sharp against the flames. "Close the door," he said without turning. I hesitated, then obeyed. The click of the latch seemed very loud in the stillness. He turned to face me then, and I saw something in his expression I had never seen before, something raw and uncertain. "Miss Whitmore," he began, then stopped. He seemed to be struggling with himself, this man who was always so controlled, so precise in his words and actions. I waited, my heart beating so hard I was sure he could hear it. "I have a question to ask you," he said at last. "One that may shock you, one that I have no right to ask, given the disparity in our positions. But I find I cannot remain silent any longer." He crossed the room to stand before me, close enough that I could see the firelight reflected in his eyes, could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and tobacco that clung to his clothes. He looked at me as if I were the only thing in the world that mattered, and I felt something inside me begin to crack, some wall I had built to protect myself from hope and longing. "I have come to regard you," he said quietly, "with a feeling that goes far beyond respect or admiration. You have brought light into this house, into my life, in ways I did not think possible. You have shown me that it is not too late for me to feel again, to want again. And so I must ask you, even knowing that it is selfish, even knowing that I may be placing an impossible burden upon you." He took my hand then, his fingers warm and strong around mine, and I felt the world tilt on its axis. "Miss Whitmore, Clara, will you consent to be my wife?" I stared at him, unable to speak, unable to breathe. The words hung in the air between us, impossible and beautiful and terrifying. But before I could answer, before I could find my voice, he continued, and his next words filled me with a dread so profound I felt the floor shift beneath my feet. "I must be honest with you," he said. "I cannot offer you the wedding you deserve, not yet. My position, my family, the expectations of society, they are complicated in ways I cannot easily explain. If we are to marry, it must be done in secret, at least for now. No announcement, no public ceremony. Only the two of us and a trusted clergyman. I know it is much to ask. I know it places you in a position of great vulnerability. But I swear to you, on my honor, that I will protect you, that I will never allow harm to come to you, and that when the time is right, I will claim you before the world as my Duchess." His eyes searched mine, desperate for understanding, for acceptance. And I, standing there with my hand in his, with the weight of my false name and my hidden past pressing down upon me, felt the trap close around my heart. I should have refused. I should have told him the truth, confessed everything, and walked away before the lies grew too large to contain. But I was weak, and I was in love, and the thought of belonging to him, even in secret, even with all the danger it carried, was more than I could resist. "Yes," I whispered, "yes, I will marry you." The relief that flooded his face was so profound, so genuine, that for a moment I almost believed it would be all right, that love could be enough to overcome the weight of deception. He pulled me into his arms then, held me against his chest with a tenderness that broke my heart, and I felt his breath warm against my hair as he murmured words of devotion and gratitude. I closed my eyes and tried to memorize the feeling of being wanted, being cherished, knowing that it might not last, that secrets have a way of rising to the surface no matter how deep they are buried. We were married 3 days later, in a small chapel 10 miles from Ashford Hall, with only the elderly vicar as witness. The Duke placed a ring on my finger, a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother, and we spoke the vows that bound us together before God and law. I became the Duchess of Ashford in that quiet ceremony, though no one else would know it, though I would return to the nursery wing and continue my duties as governess while my husband slept alone in his great chamber and we played our parts for the world. It was a strange existence, those weeks that followed. By day, I was Miss Whitmore, the governess, demure and proper and invisible. By night, when the household slept, I would slip through the darkened corridors to his rooms, and we would lie together in the firelight, talking in whispers, learning the contours of each other's hearts. He told me about his first love, the girl who had died of consumption when he was barely more than a boy, how he had sworn never to love again, how he had built his life around duty and control. I told him as much of my own history as I dared, speaking of loneliness and loss, of the hunger for belonging, carefully editing out the parts that would destroy us both. I was happy in those stolen hours. I allowed myself to believe that this secret marriage could be enough, that we could exist in this twilight space between truth and pretense forever. But I should have known better. I should have remembered that London society has eyes everywhere, that gossip is currency among the bored and the titled, and that no secret can remain hidden for long when there are those who make it their business to uncover what others wish to conceal. It was Lady Pemberton who set the wheels in motion, though I did not know it at the time. She was a widow of considerable fortune and even greater ambition, a woman who had decided that the Duke of Ashford would make an ideal second husband, and who did not appreciate the way his attention had shifted, the way he had withdrawn from the social engagements where she had been angling to secure his interest. She began to watch him, to make inquiries, and when she learned that he had been seen in the company of his young governess, that he looked at me with an expression she recognized, her curiosity turned to suspicion, and her suspicion to determination. She came to Ashford Hall in mid-January, ostensibly to call upon the Duke's sister, the Dowager Duchess, who maintained apartments in the East Wing. But her true purpose, I would later understand, was reconnaissance. She observed me with Lady Constance in the nursery, noted the quality of my speech, the refinement of my manners, the way the Duke's eyes followed me when he thought no one was watching. And she began to make connections, to ask questions, to probe the edges of the story I had told. I met her properly at a small dinner party the Dowager Duchess hosted for a select few guests. I was not meant to attend, but Lady Constance had a nightmare, and I was summoned to calm her. And the Dowager, observing how quickly the child settled in my arms, insisted I remain for the evening to keep the girl company. So I sat in the corner of the drawing room, Lady Constance drowsing against my shoulder, while the conversation flowed around me, and Lady Pemberton watched me with eyes like a hawk. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore," she said suddenly, drawing the attention of the room, "where did you say you trained as a governess?" I kept my voice steady. "At Mrs. Bellingham's academy in Hampshire, my lady." She smiled, a thin, sharp smile. "How curious. I have a cousin who attended Mrs. Bellingham's. Perhaps you were there at the same time. What years were you in residence?" I named the years I had memorized, the careful dates that matched the forged references. "How interesting," she murmured. "And your father was a vicar, I believe? In which parish?" I answered that question too, and the next, each one feeling like a blade testing the strength of my armor. The Duke, I noticed, had gone very still, his attention fixed on the exchange with an intensity that made my stomach clench. He knew, I thought. He knew she was hunting me. The evening ended eventually, and Lady Pemberton took her leave with gracious words and a glance at me that promised this was not finished. I carried Lady Constance back to the nursery and sat by her bed for a long time, staring at the shadows on the wall, trying to quiet the panic rising in my chest. He came to me near midnight, as I knew he would. His face was grave as he closed the door softly behind him. "She suspects something," he said without preamble. "I do not know what, but she is digging into your past. I saw it in her questions tonight." "I know," I whispered. He crossed to me, took my hands in his. "Clara, if there is anything at all, that I should know, anything that could be used against you, you must tell me now. I can protect you, but only if I know what we are facing." I looked up at him, at this man who had given me his name and his heart, and I felt the words rising in my throat, the confession that would end everything. But fear is a powerful thing, and cowardice even more so. I shook my head. "There is nothing," I lied. "Only the usual malice of a woman who sees another as a rival." He searched my face, and I saw the doubt there, the beginning of questions he did not want to ask. But in the end, he chose to believe me, or perhaps he chose to avoid the truth he suspected. He kissed my forehead and left me there in the darkness with my secrets and my shame. It was 3 days later that Lady Pemberton sent out invitations for a séance. The practice of spiritualism had become fashionable among the London elite, a parlor entertainment wrapped in the trappings of mysticism and the occult. Mediums claimed to channel the voices of the dead, to draw aside the veil between worlds, and society ladies flocked to their performances with a mixture of genuine belief and thrilled skepticism. Lady Pemberton, it seemed, had engaged the services of Madame Volkoff, a Russian medium of considerable reputation, to conduct a sitting at her townhouse. The guest list was small and carefully selected, including the Duke of Ashford, his sister the Dowager Duchess, and a handful of other titled individuals, and me. Because Lady Pemberton, with exquisite cruelty, had insisted that Miss Whitmore be included, as Lady Constance had grown so attached to her governess, and the child would be attending with her aunt. I did not want to go. Every instinct screamed at me to feign illness, to make some excuse, to stay away from whatever trap Lady Pemberton was preparing. But the Duke himself asked me to attend, told me it would please him to have me there, and I could not refuse him without raising the very questions I was desperate to avoid. So, on a bitterly cold evening in late January, I found myself in Lady Pemberton's drawing room, seated at a round table draped in black velvet, surrounded by flickering candles and the scent of incense. Madame Volkoff sat at the head of the table, a woman of indeterminate age with dark, penetrating eyes and long, thin fingers adorned with silver rings. She spoke in a low, accented voice about the spirits that walk among us, the messages they carry, the truths they long to reveal. I felt the Duke's presence beside me, the warmth of his arm nearly touching mine. Lady Constance sat on my other side, her small hand gripping mine with excitement and a touch of fear. Across the table, Lady Pemberton watched me with that same sharp smile, and I knew, with a certainty that made my blood run cold, that whatever was about to happen had been orchestrated, that this was the moment she had been waiting for. Madame Volkoff asked us to join hands. The circle closed around the table, and the medium closed her eyes, her breathing deepening, her body swaying slightly. The candles flickered, though there was no breeze. The room grew colder, the shadows longer. "There is a presence here," Madame Volkoff intoned, "a spirit with a message, a truth that must be spoken. It concerns one among us, one who wears a face that is not her own, who carries a name that was never meant to be hers." My heart stopped. Lady Constance's hand tightened on mine. The medium's eyes opened, but they were blank, unfocused, as if she were looking at something none of us could see. She turned her head slowly, inexorably, until she was staring directly at me. "You," she whispered. "The woman beside the child. The spirit speaks of you. It says you are bound by chains of the past, that you fled from blood and shame, that you took the identity of a dead girl to hide what you have done." The room had gone utterly silent. Every eye was on me now, and I felt the weight of their stares like physical blows. The Duke's hand found mine beneath the table, gripping hard, and I did not know if he was offering support or demanding explanation. "Who are you?" Madame Volkov asked, her voice rising, taking on an edge of something wild and terrible. "Who are you, really? What name did you bury? What sin did you commit that sent you running into the darkness?" I tried to speak, tried to deny it, but no words would come. My throat had closed, my chest was tight, and I could feel the room spinning around me. And then Madame Volkov spoke again, and the words she spoke were the ones I had prayed would never be spoken, the name I had tried so hard to forget. "Eliza Thorne," she said, and the sound of it was like a death knell. "That is who you were. That is who you are. Eliza Thorne, who was present the night a man died, who disappeared before the magistrate could question her, who has been sought for 6 years and never found." The candles guttered and went out, plunging the room into darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the fire. Someone screamed. Lady Constance was crying, and I sat frozen in my chair, my secret finally, irrevocably exposed, while the Duke's hand released mine and the silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. My marriage, my happiness, my carefully constructed life, it had all just shattered like glass, and I did not know if there was any way to put the pieces back together. The servants managed to relight the candles within moments, but the darkness that had descended upon me did not lift with the return of the flames. I sat perfectly still at that table, watching the faces around me shift from shock to fascination to cold judgment, and I knew that the life I had built was ending, that every careful lie was unraveling, that there was no way to stop what had been set in motion. Lady Constance was sobbing against my arm, frightened by the theatrics and the sudden change in atmosphere, but I could not comfort her. I could not move at all. The Duke had risen from his seat and stood behind me, one hand on the back of my chair, and I could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. He had not spoken since Madame Volkov uttered my real name, and his silence was more terrifying than any words could have been. Lady Pemberton was the first to break the stunned quiet. Her voice was smooth, almost gentle, but I heard the triumph beneath it. "Madame Volkov," she said, "that was quite extraordinary. I have attended many sittings, but never one with such specific revelations." She turned to me with false concern painted across her features. "Miss Whitmore, or should I say Miss Thorne, are you quite all right? You have gone very pale." I found my voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "This is nonsense. The woman is a fraud. She knows nothing about me." The medium regarded me with those dark, fathomless eyes, and I could not tell if she truly believed she had been possessed by spirits, or if she was simply an actress playing her part perfectly. She said nothing more, only gathered her shawls around her and settled back in her chair with an air of exhaustion, as if the channeling had drained her. The Dowager Duchess, a formidable woman who had always treated me with distant courtesy, fixed me with a stare that could have frozen water. "I think," she said coldly, "that it would be best if Miss Whitmore returned to Ashford Hall immediately. This evening has become far too distressing for Lady Constance." She was giving me an escape, I realized, or perhaps simply removing the source of scandal from her presence. Either way, I was grateful. I rose from my chair, gently extracting myself from Lady Constance's grip, murmuring soothing words to the child even as my own world crumbled around me. The Duke still had not looked at me, had not spoken, and that absence of acknowledgement felt like a knife twisting in my chest. "I will take her home," I said quietly. "I apologize for the disruption to the evening." Lady Pemberton's smile widened. "Oh, I think we are all quite grateful for the entertainment, Miss Thorne. It is not every day that one discovers a wanted woman hiding in plain sight among respectable society." The words hit like a physical blow. Wanted. Of course, she would put it that way, would make it sound as if I were some criminal fleeing justice, rather than a terrified girl who had run from circumstances she could not control. But I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. I kept my chin high and my expression calm as I collected Lady Constance and made my way toward the door. The Duke's voice stopped me just as my hand touched the handle. "Clara." I turned, hope flaring painfully in my chest. He had used my chosen name, not the one the medium had revealed. Perhaps that meant something. Perhaps he still saw me as the woman he had married, not as the ghost from the past that Lady Pemberton was determined to resurrect. But when I met his eyes, I saw only confusion and something that looked terribly like betrayal. "We will speak when I return home," he said, his tone formal, distant, as if I were once again merely the governess and he the master. "Until then, you will remain in your rooms." It was not a request. It was a command, and it carried the full weight of his authority. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and fled the townhouse with Lady Constance in tow. The carriage ride back to Ashford Hall was a blur of tears and whispered reassurances to the child, who did not understand what had happened but sensed that everything had changed. I carried her up to the nursery and stayed with her until she fell into an exhausted sleep, then retreated to my own small chamber and locked the door behind me. I stood in the center of that modest room, surrounded by the few possessions I had accumulated during my time as Clara Whitmore, and I felt the full weight of what I had done, of the lies I had told, of the man I had deceived. I loved him. That was the worst part, the part that made everything else unbearable. I loved him desperately, completely, in a way I had not known I was capable of loving. And now he would learn the truth about me, the whole ugly truth, and whatever fragile trust had existed between us would shatter beyond repair. I sat by the window and watched the darkness beyond the glass, waiting for him to return, knowing that when he did, I would have to tell him everything. There would be no more hiding, no more carefully constructed half-truths. He had married a woman who did not exist, and he deserved to know who I really was, even if that knowledge destroyed us both. He came to me near dawn. I had not slept, had barely moved from my position by the window, and when I heard his footsteps in the corridor, I rose on unsteady legs and unlocked the door. He entered without knocking, closing it softly behind him, and for a long moment we simply stood there, looking at each other across the space of that small room. He was still dressed in his evening clothes, but his cravat was loosened and his hair disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness and something deeper, something that looked like grief. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice rough. "Are you Eliza Thorne?" I closed my eyes briefly, gathering what courage remained to me. Yes. The single word seemed to echo in the silence. I heard him draw a sharp breath, heard the faint creak of floorboards as he moved closer. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me everything. Not the story you invented for the agency, not the carefully edited version you have been feeding me. The truth, Clara, or Eliza, whoever you are. I want to know who I married." So I told him. I told him about the girl I had been, the daughter of a merchant who had drunk and gambled away his fortune and his respectability. I told him about my mother's death from shame and heartbreak, about being sent at 16 to live with my uncle, a doctor who practiced in the poorer districts of London, who took me in more out of duty than affection. I told him about the night 6 years ago when a patient came to my uncle's surgery, a man who had been stabbed in a tavern brawl, bleeding and desperate. "My uncle tried to save him," I said, my voice steady, though my hands were shaking. "He worked for hours, but the wound was too deep, the damage too severe. The man died on the operating table just before midnight. And then his companions came, the men he had been drinking with, demanding to know what had happened. They were rough men, dangerous men, and they did not believe it was an accident. They thought my uncle had killed him deliberately for his money or out of some grudge. They threatened us. They said they would go to the magistrate, would see us both hanged for murder. I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling the cold of that night seeping back into my bones. My uncle was terrified. He told me to run, to disappear, to take on a new identity and never come back. He said he would handle the men, would explain to the authorities, but that I needed to be far away in case they came looking for someone to blame. So I took what little money he could spare, took the papers of a girl named Clara Whitmore who had died of fever in my uncle's care, a girl with no family to ask questions, and I ran. "And your uncle?" the Duke asked quietly. "What became of him?" "I do not know," I whispered. "I have not dared to contact him, to ask, to even try to find out if he is alive or dead. I have been too afraid that any inquiry would lead back to me, would expose what I had done." The Duke was silent for a long time, absorbing the story, weighing it against everything he thought he knew about me. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "You fled a situation that may not have required fleeing. You assumed guilt where there may have been none. You created an entirely false identity and lived under it for 6 years, deceiving everyone around you." "Yes," I said simply. There was no point in denying it, no point in trying to soften the edges of what I had done. He turned away from me, walked to the window where I had spent the night keeping vigil, and stared out at the gray dawn. "And when I asked you to marry me, when I offered you my name and my protection, you said nothing. You allowed me to bind myself to you legally, morally, without knowing that you were wanted for questioning in a man's death." The words stung, even though they were true. I could have defended myself, could have pointed out that he had wanted secrecy as much as I had, that he had been the one to insist on a hidden marriage. But that would have been cruel and unfair, and I was already guilty of enough. "I am sorry," I said instead. "I know that is inadequate. I know it does not excuse what I have done. But I am sorry, more than I can ever express." He turned back to me, and I saw then the full measure of his pain, the betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. "I loved you," he said, and the past tense felt like a death sentence. "I gave you everything I had to give, and you were someone else the entire time." "I loved you too," I whispered. "I still love you. That was never a lie. But how can I believe that? How can I believe anything you say when the foundation of everything between us was built on deception?" I had no answer for him. He was right to question me, right to doubt, right to feel wounded and betrayed. I had taken his trust and his love, and I had repaid them with lies. He pressed his hands to his face, and for a moment he looked utterly lost. "Lady Pemberton will not let this rest," he said finally. "She will make inquiries. She will contact the authorities. She will do everything in her power to see you brought before a magistrate, if only to ruin me by association." "I know," I said. "I will leave. I will disappear again. You can say I deceived you as I deceived everyone else, that you had no knowledge of my past. Your name will be protected." He looked at me sharply. "You think I would throw you to the wolves to save my reputation? What else can you do? I cannot drag you down with me. You have a title, a family, responsibilities. I am no one. Let me go, and this will end before it destroys you." "No," he said, and the word was hard, final. "You are my wife. That bond was made before God, regardless of what name you used. I will not abandon you, Clara. But you must help me to help you. We need to know exactly what happened that night, whether your uncle is alive, whether there is truly any legal case against you, or if this is merely fear and guilt that has been driving you. How can we possibly find out without exposing me?" I asked helplessly. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "I have a friend, Marcus Carlyle. He is a barrister. one of the best in London, and more importantly, he is discreet. I will contact him, ask him to make quiet inquiries into the death of a man 6 years ago, into what became of the doctor who attended him. We will learn the truth, and then we will decide what must be done. It was a thin hope, but it was more than I had allowed myself in years. You would do that for me? I asked, even knowing what I am? You are my wife, he said again, as if that explained everything. And I made vows to you. For better or for worse, I intend to honor them, even if the worse is more than I anticipated. He left me then, and I sank into the chair by the window, exhausted and overwhelmed, and cautiously, dangerously hopeful. He had not forgiven me, I knew that. The wounds I had inflicted were too fresh, the betrayal too deep. But he had not abandoned me either, and that was more than I had any right to expect. The next days were strange and suspended, as if we all existed in a held breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The Duke sent word to Mr. Carlyle, who replied that he would begin his inquiries immediately and with the utmost discretion. Lady Pemberton, true to expectation, began making her own inquiries, speaking to her connections in legal circles, trying to discover if there were any outstanding warrants or investigations related to Eliza Thorne. The Dowager Duchess retreated to her apartments and refused to speak of the matter, though her disapproval hung over the household like a pall. I remained in my rooms as instructed, venturing out only to attend to Lady Constance, who clung to me with unusual intensity, as if she sensed that I might disappear. The Duke came to see me each evening, but our conversations were strained, formal, lacking the warmth and intimacy that had characterized our hidden marriage. He told me about the progress of the investigation, such as it was, but we did not speak of anything personal. The distance between us grew wider each day, and I did not know how to bridge it. It was on the 5th day after the séance that Mr. Carlyle came to Ashford Hall in person. I was summoned to the library where he and the Duke were waiting, and the moment I entered the room, I knew from their expressions that the news was not good. Mr. Carlyle was a man of middle years, sharp-featured and elegant, with the kind of incisive gaze that made me feel as if every secret I had ever kept was written plainly on my face. He bowed slightly as I entered, a courtesy that surprised me given my circumstances, and gestured for me to sit. "Miss Thorne," he began, then corrected himself at a glance from the Duke. "Your Grace, I have made the inquiries His Grace requested, and I have some information that may interest you." I sat on the edge of the chair, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "Please," I said, "whatever you have learned, I need to know." He nodded gravely. "Your uncle, Dr. Henry Thorne, is alive and still practicing medicine in Whitechapel. He was questioned extensively after the death of the patient you mentioned, a man named John Garrett, who was indeed a known criminal with connections to several violent gangs. The initial investigation suggested foul play, but further examination of the body and testimony from other witnesses established that the wound was consistent with a knife fight and that Dr. Thorne had made every effort to save the man's life. No charges were ever brought against him. Relief flooded through me so intensely I felt dizzy. He was cleared? He was not arrested? He was not, Mr. Carlyle confirmed. However, the matter of your disappearance remained a mystery. Your uncle told the authorities that you had been sent to relatives in the country for your safety, but he could not or would not provide details. Over time, the case was closed as a justifiable death, and interest in locating you faded. You were never formally wanted, Miss Thorne. You were, at most, a person the magistrate wished to interview. I stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. I was not wanted. There were no charges. I had spent 6 years living in fear, hiding behind a false name, building walls around myself to avoid a threat that had never truly existed. "So I ran for nothing," I whispered. "I destroyed my life, my uncle's peace of mind, everything, for nothing." The Duke's voice was quiet but firm. "You ran because you were frightened, because rough men had threatened you. You were 16 years old and alone in the world. You made the best decision you could with the information you had. But it was the wrong decision, I said, my voice breaking. I could have stayed. I could have told the truth. I could have saved myself years of fear and loneliness. Mr. Carlyle cleared his throat delicately. There is, unfortunately, a complication. I looked up at him, my brief hope already beginning to dim. What complication? He exchanged a glance with the Duke. While you were never formally wanted, your disappearance and your use of a false identity are now matters of public knowledge thanks to Lady Pemberton's efforts. She has been in contact with several magistrates, making inquiries about you, suggesting that you may have been involved in criminal activity. While there is no basis for prosecution regarding the death 6 years ago, the act of assuming another person's identity and using it to gain employment under false pretenses could potentially be considered fraud. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. So I am in danger after all. Possibly, Mr. Carlyle said carefully. Much depends on whether anyone chooses to pursue the matter. If Lady Pemberton can convince a magistrate to take an interest, you could face charges. However, the Duke's position and influence may provide some protection. A man of his standing publicly supporting his wife, even one whose past is complicated, carries considerable weight. But I am not publicly his wife, I said bitterly. That was the entire point of our arrangement. We married in secret to avoid scandal. The Duke had been standing by the fireplace, his face unreadable, but now he turned to look at me directly. Then perhaps it is time to change that. I met his eyes, searching for the meaning behind his words. What are you saying? I am saying that I will make a public announcement of our marriage. I will claim you before society as my Duchess. It will not be easy. There will be gossip, disapproval, perhaps even a degree of social ostracism. But it will make it far more difficult for anyone to pursue legal action against you. A duchess is not easily prosecuted, particularly when her husband is willing to vouch for her character. You cannot, I said immediately. You will ruin yourself, your family, your position, everything you have worked to protect. He smiled then, a small, sad smile that broke my heart. Perhaps I am tired of protection. Perhaps I am tired of living my life according to what society expects rather than what I want. You are my wife, Clara. For better or for worse, remember? I chose you, and I will stand by that choice, consequences be damned. Tears burned in my eyes. I do not deserve this. I do not deserve you. Probably not, he agreed, but there was a gentleness in his voice now, the first softening I had heard since the night of the séance. But we rarely get what we deserve in this life. We get what we are willing to fight for. Mr. Carlyle rose from his chair, clearly sensing that the conversation had moved beyond his purview. I will prepare the necessary documents to formalize your Grace's public acknowledgement of the marriage, he said. In the meantime, I advise you both to avoid any further contact with Lady Pemberton or her associates. The less fuel you give to speculation, the better. He bowed and departed, leaving the Duke and me alone in the library. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he crossed the room and knelt before my chair, taking my hands in his with a tenderness that made the tears spill over. I am still angry, he said quietly. I am still hurt. You deceived me, Clara, and that betrayal cuts deep. But I have had time to think about everything you told me, about the girl you were and the woman you have become. You made mistakes, grave mistakes, but they were born of fear, not malice, and I cannot condemn you for running when you felt you had no choice. I gripped his hands tightly, barely able to see him through the blur of tears. I am so sorry, I whispered, for all of it, for the lies, for the deception, for not trusting you enough to tell you the truth before we married. We will work past this, he said. It will take time. We will need to rebuild trust, to learn how to be honest with each other, even when the truth is difficult. But I believe we can do it. I believe what we have is worth fighting for." He pulled me into his arms then, held me close as I wept against his chest, and for the first time since that terrible night at Lady Pemberton's townhouse, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps, somehow, we might survive this, that the worst was behind us and that we could find our way back to each other. But I was wrong. The worst was not behind us. It was only beginning. The Duke announced our marriage 3 days later at a formal dinner hosted by the Dowager Duchess, who had finally emerged from her self-imposed isolation to face the scandal with the steel spine that had carried her through decades of navigating London society. She did not approve. That much was clear from the tight set of her mouth and the cold formality with which she addressed me, but she was a pragmatist above all else, and she understood that the family's best chance of weathering the storm was to present a united front. I stood beside my husband in the grand dining room of Ashford Hall, wearing a gown of deep emerald silk that the Dowager herself had insisted I wear, her own subtle way of signaling that I was now one of them, regardless of her personal feelings. The assembled guests, a carefully selected group of influential families whose support the Duke hoped to secure, listened in stunned silence as he made his announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority that came from generations of noble breeding, "I have gathered you here this evening to share news of a personal nature. Some weeks ago, I entered into a marriage with Miss Clara Whitmore, who has been governess to my niece. The ceremony was private, conducted with the blessing of my family, and I now wish to formally present my wife to you as the Duchess of Ashford." The silence that followed was profound. I could feel the weight of every gaze upon me, calculating, judging, comparing me to what they had expected a Duchess of Ashford to be. I kept my chin high and my expression serene, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. It was Lord Hartley, an elderly earl with connections to half the peerage, who spoke first. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "there have been certain rumors circulating. Allegations regarding your wife's past, her true identity. I wonder if you might address these concerns." The Duke's expression did not change, but I felt his hand tighten slightly on my arm where it rested against his. "I am aware of the rumors, Lord Hartley. My wife's history is indeed more complicated than initially understood. She was born Eliza Thorne, the niece of Dr. Henry Thorne, a physician of good standing who continues to practice in London. As a young woman, she found herself in frightening circumstances following a patient's death and made the understandable but ill-advised decision to flee rather than trust in the justice system. She has since learned that no charges were ever contemplated against her or her uncle. The use of an assumed name was an error born of youth and fear, nothing more. It was a masterful piece of spin, presenting the truth while framing it in the most sympathetic possible light. But I could see from the faces around the table that not everyone was convinced. Lady Pemberton, who had somehow secured an invitation despite the Duke's best efforts to exclude her, spoke up with false sweetness. "How fascinating. And tell me, Your Grace, were you aware of your wife's true identity when you married her?" The trap was obvious and brutal. If he said yes, he looked like a fool who had knowingly tied himself to a woman of questionable background. If he said no, I looked like a calculating deceiver who had tricked him into marriage. But my husband was not a man easily trapped. "I married the woman I came to know over months of observation and conversation," he said calmly. "A woman of intelligence, compassion, and strength. Whatever name she used, whatever fears drove her decisions, those qualities were genuine. I do not regret my choice. It was not quite an answer to her question, but it was enough to deflect it, and I felt a surge of gratitude and love for this man who was willing to parse words and navigate social minefields to protect me." The evening proceeded in fits and starts, with some guests offering cautious congratulations, while others remained coolly distant. I played my part as best I could, answering questions about my plans for managing the household, my thoughts on the upcoming season, the charities I hoped to support. I tried to be everything a duchess should be, gracious and poised and unremarkable, hoping that if I could demonstrate my fitness for the role, the questions about my past might eventually fade. But as the guests began to depart, and I stood with the Duke in the entrance hall bidding them farewell, I could see the speculation in their eyes, hear the whispers that started before they even reached their carriages. By morning, all of London would know that the Duke of Ashford had married a governess of dubious origins who had lived under a false name. Some would view it as romantic, a love match that transcended social boundaries. Most would view it as scandalous, a stain on one of England's oldest and most respected titles. When the last guest had gone and the great doors closed behind them, the Duke turned to me with an expression of exhaustion. "Well," he said quietly, "it is done. For better or worse, you are now publicly my Duchess." "I am sorry," I whispered. "I am sorry for what this will cost you." He touched my cheek gently. "Stop apologizing, Clara. We have made our choice. Now we must live with it." But over the following weeks, I began to understand just how heavy a burden that choice would be. Invitations that had been extended to the Duke were quietly withdrawn. Friends who had been constant visitors to Ashford Hall found reasons to stay away. The Dowager Duchess maintained a frigid courtesy toward me, but made it clear through 1,000 small gestures that she considered me an embarrassment to the family. Even Lady Constance, who had been so devoted to me, began to sense the shift in the household's atmosphere and grew uncertain in my presence, as if she no longer knew what role I was meant to play in her life. The Duke bore it all with stoic grace, attending to his parliamentary duties, managing his estates, refusing to acknowledge the social snubbing he was receiving. But I could see the strain in the tight lines around his mouth, the way he withdrew into himself in the evenings, the distance that had crept back between us despite his earlier promises of reconciliation. We were living in a state of siege, and I was the fortress under attack. It was during this difficult time that I received an unexpected visitor. I was in the morning room, attempting to focus on correspondence that I had no real authority to write, when the butler announced that a Dr. Henry Thorne wished to see me. My uncle. After 6 years of silence and separation, my uncle had come. I rose on unsteady legs, my heart pounding. "Show him in, please." He entered the room slowly, and I was shocked by how much he had aged. The robust man, I remembered, had become stooped and gray, his face deeply lined, his hands trembling slightly as he removed his hat. But his eyes, when they met mine, were the same sharp blue I remembered, full of intelligence and an unexpected tenderness. "Eliza," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "My dear girl, I have been searching for you for so long." I crossed the room and embraced him, feeling the tears I had been holding back for weeks finally break free. "Uncle Henry, I am so sorry. I am so sorry for running, for not trusting you, for disappearing without word." He held me tightly, patting my back with those trembling hands. "Hush now. You were a frightened child. You did what you thought you must. I never blamed you for it." We sat together on the sofa, and he told me of the years that had passed, of how he had tried to find me, of the guilt he had carried for sending me away. I learned that he had never married, that his practice had consumed his life, that he had been waiting and hoping for some sign that I was safe. "When I learned of your marriage to the Duke," he said, "when I heard your name spoken in connection with this household, I could scarcely believe it. I came as soon as I could arrange the time away from my patients. I had to see for myself that you were well, that you had found happiness despite everything. I wiped at my tears, trying to smile. I have found more than I ever dreamed possible, but I have also brought scandal and shame to a man who deserved neither." He studied my face carefully. "You love him," he said. "It was not a question." "With all my heart." "And he loves you?" I hesitated. "He did. He married me before he knew the truth. Now I do not know if what we have can survive the weight of my deception and the social consequences it has brought." My uncle was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised me. "Eliza, I have spent my life among the sick and the dying. I have seen more of human nature in its worst and best moments than most men ever witness. And I can tell you this with certainty. Love that is real, love that is deep, it does not shatter easily. It bends, it strains, it may even crack. But if the foundation is true, it holds. I wanted desperately to believe him. But before I could respond, the Duke himself entered the room, having been informed of our visitor's identity. He greeted my uncle with courtesy, invited him to stay for dinner, and the three of us spent the evening in conversation that was by turns awkward and surprisingly warm. My uncle told stories of my childhood, of the bright, curious girl I had been before tragedy had shaped me into someone harder and more fearful. The Duke listened intently, and I saw in his expression a hunger to know this version of me, the girl I had been before I became Clara Whitmore. It was late when my uncle finally departed, promising to visit again soon, and the Duke and I were left alone in the drawing room. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls, and we sat in silence for several minutes before he spoke. "He loves you very much," he said quietly. "Your uncle. The guilt he carries for sending you away, it has marked him deeply." "He did what he thought was best," I replied, "as did I, as have you. We have all been doing what we thought was right, and somehow we have still ended up here, trapped in this impossible situation." The Duke turned to look at me, and in the firelight his face was softer than I had seen it in weeks. "Is it so impossible, Clara? Are we truly trapped, or are we simply afraid?" I met his gaze. "I am afraid," I admitted. "I am afraid that you will wake up one day and realize that I am not worth what you have sacrificed, that the scandal and the social exile and the disapproval of your family are too high a price to pay for a woman who lied to you from the beginning." He moved closer, took my hands in his. "And I am afraid that you will never truly trust me, that you will always believe yourself unworthy of love, that you will live the rest of your life waiting for me to abandon you." "We are quite a pair," I said with a small, sad laugh. "We are," he agreed. "But perhaps that is not such a terrible thing. Perhaps two broken people can help each other heal." He kissed me then, gently at first, and then with increasing intensity, and for the first time since the séance, I felt the distance between us begin to close. We retired to his chambers that night, and in the warmth of his bed, in the circle of his arms, I allowed myself to hope that we might find our way back to each other after all. But hope, I was learning, is a fragile thing, easily shattered by forces beyond our control. It began with a letter delivered 3 days after my uncle's visit. The Duke received it at breakfast and read it with a deepening frown, then set it aside without comment. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the troubled look in his eyes, and I knew that something was wrong. "What is it?" I asked quietly. He hesitated, then passed the letter to me. It was from Mr. Carlyle, and the news it contained made my blood run cold. Lady Pemberton had not been idle. Unable to secure a prosecution for fraud, she had turned her attention to another angle. She had located Garrett's former associates, the rough men who had threatened my uncle 6 years ago, and she had apparently promised them a substantial sum of money if they would come forward with testimony suggesting that my uncle had, in fact, been negligent in his treatment of their companion, and that I had been complicit in covering up that negligence. It was absurd, of course. Mr. Carlyle's letter made clear that there was no real evidence to support such claims, and that any halfway competent barrister would tear their testimony apart. But the mere existence of the accusations would be enough to resurrect the scandal, to keep the gossip alive, to make it impossible for society to accept me. More troubling still, the letter warned, was that one of these men had mentioned in his statement that I had been present during the surgery, that I had assisted my uncle, and that I had seemed unusually calm for a young girl witnessing a man's death. He had implied, in language that was vague but suggestive, that perhaps I had not been as innocent as I claimed, that perhaps there had been something unnatural in my behavior. It was the beginning of a new accusation, one far more sinister than simple fraud or identity theft. They were suggesting, in careful, deniable terms, that I had been complicit in murder. "This is madness," I whispered, staring at the letter. I was 16 years old. I held bandages and fetched water. I did nothing wrong. "I know that," the Duke said firmly. "Mr. Carlyle knows that. Any reasonable person would know that. But Lady Pemberton is not interested in truth. She is interested in destroying us." "Why?" I asked helplessly. "What have we ever done to her?" "You exist," he said simply. "You won our attention, our affection, in a way she never could. And for a woman like her, that is an unforgivable crime." He stood, began pacing the room with barely controlled anger. "We will fight this," he said. "We will hire the best barristers. We will bring character witnesses. We will demonstrate beyond any doubt that you are innocent of any wrongdoing." But even as he spoke, I could see the weariness in his face, the knowledge that we were fighting a battle that might have no end. Lady Pemberton had resources, connections, and most importantly, she had time. She could keep launching accusations, keep stirring up scandal, keep making our lives miserable for as long as she chose, unless we gave her what she wanted. The thought came to me suddenly, cold and clear. I set down the letter and looked at my husband. This good man who had risked everything for me, who was being slowly destroyed by his association with me. "What if I left?" I said quietly. He stopped pacing, turned to stare at me. "What? What if I went away?" "Left England, perhaps. Went to the continent where no one knows my name or cares about London scandal. You could say the marriage was annulled, that you discovered something that made it legally void. You could rebuild your reputation, reconnect with society, find someone appropriate to be your Duchess." "Absolutely not," he said, his voice hard. "We have had this conversation before, Clara. You are my wife. I will not abandon you. But if I choose to leave, if I decide that this is too much, that I cannot bear to watch you suffer for my mistakes—" He crossed the room in 3 strides, gripped my shoulders firmly. "Listen to me," he said, his gray eyes burning into mine. "I did not marry you on a whim. I did not choose you because you were convenient or appropriate or scandal-free. I chose you because you are brave and resilient and kind, because you survived circumstances that would have broken most people. Because when I am with you, I feel less alone, and I will be damned if I let Lady Pemberton or anyone else take that away from me." His words were fierce, passionate, and they should have reassured me. But all I could think about was the letter, the accusations that would keep coming, the endless siege that would wear us both down until there was nothing left but exhaustion and regret. "I love you," I whispered, "but I do not know if love is enough." "It has to be," he said, pulling me into his arms, "because it is all we have." We stood there holding each other in the morning light, and I tried to believe him, tried to trust that somehow we would find a way through this darkness. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice was whispering that the worst was still ahead, that Lady Pemberton would not stop until she had destroyed us completely, and that the choice I would ultimately have to make might be between my love for the Duke and his future happiness. And I was not sure which I would choose. That night, I had a dream. I was back in my uncle's surgery, 16 years old again, watching a man die on the operating table. But this time, when his companions came demanding answers, it was not my uncle they accused. It was me. They pointed at me with blood-stained fingers, calling me murderer, witch, unnatural creature. And when I turned to run, I found the Duke standing in the doorway, blocking my escape. "Choose," he said in the dream, his face impassive. "Choose between the truth and your freedom, between love and safety, between who you were and who you pretend to be." I woke, gasping, my heart racing. The Duke's arms around me in the darkness. He murmured soothing words, stroked my hair, pulled me close until my breathing steadied. But I could not shake the feeling that the dream had been a warning, a premonition of a choice that was coming whether I wanted it or not. In the morning, another letter arrived. This one was not from Mr. Carlyle. It was from Madame Volkoff, the medium who had exposed me at the séance, and the words written in her elegant script chilled me to the bone. "Your Grace," she wrote, "I have information regarding the night your true identity was revealed. Information that suggests the spirits were not the only force at work that evening. If you wish to know the truth of what really happened, come to my residence tomorrow at sunset. Come alone, and prepare yourself for revelations that may change everything you believe about that night, about Lady Pemberton, and about the nature of the forces aligned against you." I stared at the letter, my mind racing. Was this another trap? Another scheme of Lady Pemberton's to draw me into more scandal? Or was there truly something I had missed? Some hidden element to that terrible evening that I did not understand? The Duke found me in the library, the letter trembling in my hands. He read it over my shoulder, his expression darkening. "You will not go," he said immediately. "It is obviously a ploy of some kind. But what if it is not? What if she knows something that could help us? Then I will go with you. We will face this together." She said to come alone. "And you think that is wise? To put yourself in the power of a woman who helped orchestrate your exposure?" He was right, of course. Every rational thought told me to burn the letter and forget about it. But something in Madame Volkoff's words nagged at me, a suggestion that there were layers to the situation I had not yet uncovered, that the séance itself might have been more than it appeared. "Let me think about it," I said finally. "We do not have to decide immediately." But even as I spoke, I knew I would go. I would go because I needed answers, because I was tired of being hunted and accused and judged for things I had and had not done. I would go because if there was even a chance that Madame Volkoff could tell me something that would help us fight back against Lady Pemberton, I had to take it. Even if it meant walking into danger, even if it meant defying my husband's wishes, even if it meant risking everything we had left. The sun was setting over London, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, and I stood at the window of Ashford Hall, watching the light fade and wondering what revelations the darkness would bring. I left Ashford Hall at dusk without telling the Duke where I was going, leaving only a note that said I would return before midnight and that he should not worry. It was a lie, of course, the kind of small deception that had once come so easily to me and now felt like betrayal. But I told myself it was necessary. He would have insisted on accompanying me, and something in Madame Volkoff's letter suggested that whatever she had to reveal would only be shared with me alone. The medium's residence was in Bloomsbury, in a narrow townhouse squeezed between larger, more respectable buildings, the kind of place where unconventional people lived quietly among the artists and writers and those whose professions existed on the margins of acceptability. I paid the handsome driver and stood for a moment on the darkening street, gathering my courage before climbing the steps and lifting the brass knocker. A young woman answered, pale and thin with large dark eyes that seemed to see too much. She nodded, as if she had been expecting me, and led me up a narrow staircase to a room on the second floor. The space was draped in rich fabrics, crimson and deep purple, with candles burning in elaborate holders and the heavy scent of incense hanging in the air. It was exactly the sort of theatrical setting I would have expected from a spiritualist, and yet something about it felt different tonight, less performance and more genuine. Madame Volkoff sat in a high-backed chair near the window, dressed in black silk, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger than I remembered from the séance, perhaps only a few years older than myself, and without the dramatic lighting and the audience of eager believers, she seemed almost ordinary, tired and a little sad. "Your Grace," she said, rising to greet me. "Thank you for coming. I was not certain you would." "I am here," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You said you had information about that night, about what really happened at Lady Pemberton's séance." She gestured for me to sit, then poured 2 glasses of wine from a decanter on a nearby table. "Drink," she said. This conversation will be easier if we are both a little fortified. I hesitated, then accepted the glass. The wine was good, rich and warming, and I took a sip before setting it aside. I am listening. Madame Volkov settled back in her chair, studying me with those penetrating dark eyes. First, she said, you must understand something about my profession. I am what you would call a fraud, though not entirely. I have some sensitivity to the unseen world, some ability to sense things that others cannot. But the performances I give, the messages from beyond, the theatrical revelations, they are largely constructed from research, observation, and the art of reading people. I tell my clients what they want to hear, or what they fear to hear, and I'm very good at making them believe it comes from spirits rather than from my own careful preparation. I felt a cold anger rising in me. So that night, when you exposed me, when you spoke my real name and destroyed my life, that was all a performance? You were hired by Lady Pemberton to humiliate me? She held up one hand. Please, let me finish. Yes, Lady Pemberton hired me. She came to me 3 weeks before the séance and told me she suspected that Miss Whitmore, the governess, was living under a false identity. She had made inquiries, gathered information, discovered that there was no record of a Clara Whitmore matching my description in any of the usual registers. She asked me to expose you during the sitting, to make it seem as if the spirits themselves were revealing your deception. And you agreed, I said bitterly. For money, I assume. For a great deal of money, she confirmed without shame. I am not a wealthy woman, Your Grace. I survive by my wits and my performances, and Lady Pemberton's offer was substantial. But there is something you do not know, something that happened that night, which was not part of the plan. I leaned forward, my heart beginning to race. What do you mean? Madame Volkov's expression grew troubled. I was meant to reveal your true name, yes, and to suggest that you had fled from some scandal in your past. Lady Pemberton had provided me with the basic facts, the name Eliza Thorne, the connection to a doctor in Whitechapel, the disappearance 6 years ago. But she did not tell me about the death, about the patient who died in your uncle's surgery. She did not tell me about the men who threatened you, or the specific circumstances that drove you to run. That information came from somewhere else. From where? I demanded. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I told you that I have some sensitivity to the unseen world. Most of the time, it is vague, nothing more than impressions or feelings. But occasionally, very rarely, something breaks through with clarity. That night, when I began the performance, when I opened myself to whatever energies might be present, I felt something unexpected. A presence, cold and angry and desperate to be heard. I felt the hair rise on the back of my neck. What kind of presence? A spirit, Your Grace, a genuine one. And it seized upon the opportunity I had created, the open channel between worlds, and it used me to speak. The words about the death, about blood and shame, about what you had witnessed, those did not come from Lady Pemberton's briefing. They came from something else, something that knew far more about that night than any living person should. I stared at her, torn between belief and skepticism. You expect me to believe that John Garrett's ghost possessed you during the séance, that a dead criminal reached out from beyond to accuse me? Not John Garrett, she said quietly. Someone else, someone who was connected to that night, who has been watching you, following you, waiting for the right moment to reveal what they know. Who? I asked, though I was not sure I wanted to hear the answer. I do not know, she admitted. The spirit did not give me a name. But I felt its rage, its sense of injustice. And I felt something else too, something that has haunted me ever since that night. This spirit believes you know more than you have told, that you saw something during that surgery, something that you have kept hidden even from yourself. I rose from my chair, suddenly needing to move, to pace. This is insane. I was there. I remember what happened. There was a man with a knife wound. My uncle tried to save him. He died despite our best efforts. There was no mystery, no hidden knowledge, nothing beyond a tragic accident. Are you certain? Madame Volkov asked softly. Memory is a strange thing, Your Grace. Trauma can make us forget, can hide truths too painful to face. And you were very young, very frightened. Perhaps there is something you have blocked out, something that this spirit knows and wishes you to remember. I turned to face her, my hands clenched at my sides. Why would you tell me this? Why contact me now, weeks after the séance? Because I am frightened, she said simply. Since that night, I have been plagued by terrible dreams. I see blood and darkness and a figure standing over me, demanding that I help finish what was started. I wake gasping, feeling as if something is pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. And 2 nights ago, I received a visitor. Who? Lady Pemberton. She came here demanding to know what else I had learned, what other secrets I could reveal about you. When I told her I had nothing more, that I had given her everything she paid for, she became angry. She said I was lying, that she knew I must have sensed more during the séance. And then she said something very strange. She said that if I would not help her destroy you completely, she would find someone who would, someone who had even more reason to see you brought low. Did she say who? No. But the way she said it, the certainty in her voice, it frightened me. I believe she has made contact with someone from your past, someone who knows the truth about that night, and she is planning to use them against you. I sank back into my chair, my mind reeling. This was worse than I had imagined, deeper and more dangerous than simple social scandal. If Lady Pemberton had truly found someone who had been there that night, one of Garrett's companions perhaps, someone with a grudge and a willingness to lie for profit, then she could manufacture evidence of almost anything. What should I do? I asked, hating the helplessness in my voice. Madame Volkov leaned forward, her expression earnest. You must remember, Your Grace, whatever it is that you have forgotten, whatever truth is buried in your memory of that night, you must find it and bring it to light before Lady Pemberton can twist it to her purposes. If there is innocence to be proven, prove it. If there is guilt to be confessed, confess it. But do not let her control the narrative. How am I supposed to remember something I do not even know I have forgotten? She reached into a drawer of the table beside her and withdrew a small vial of dark liquid. This is a tincture, she said. Valerian, passion flower, and a few other herbs. It will help you sleep deeply and may allow suppressed memories to surface in dreams. Take it tonight, when you are safe in your own bed, and let your mind wander back to that evening 6 years ago. Sometimes the truth reveals itself when we stop fighting so hard to avoid it. I took the vial, though I was not sure I believed in the power of herbs and dreams to unlock the past. But I had come here seeking answers, and this was all she had to offer. Is there anything else? I asked. Anything else you can tell me about the spirit? About what it wants? Only this, she said gravely. It is not finished with you. Whatever was started that night, whatever chain of events was set in motion by that man's death, it is still unfolding. And you are at the center of it, whether you wish to be or not. I left her residence with the vial clutched in my hand and my mind in turmoil. The streets of London were dark now, lit only by scattered gas lamps, and I pulled my cloak tightly around myself as I found another hansom to take me home. The driver was silent, which I was grateful for, and I stared out at the passing buildings, trying to make sense of everything I had learned. Could I really have forgotten something important? Could trauma and fear have erased some crucial detail from my memory? Or was Madame Volkov simply spinning another story, creating mystery where there was none in order to manipulate me for reasons I did not yet understand? I arrived back at Ashford Hall to find the Duke waiting for me in the entrance hall, his face set in lines of worry and anger. "Where have you been?" he demanded the moment I crossed the threshold. "I found your note hours ago. I have been imagining all manner of disasters." "I went to see Madame Volkov," I said quietly. She sent me a letter asking me to come alone, and I needed to know what she had to say. His expression darkened. You went into that woman's den without protection, without even telling me where you were going? Clara, she could have been working with Lady Pemberton to lure you into some new trap. She was working with Lady Pemberton, I confirmed, but she is frightened now. She told me things about that night at the séance, about what Lady Pemberton is planning. I recounted the conversation as we walked to his study, and he listened with increasing concern, particularly when I described Madame Volkoff's belief that a genuine spirit had manifested during the performance. He was skeptical, as I had been, but he did not dismiss it out of hand. Whether there was truly a ghost, or whether the medium simply went beyond her script, he said thoughtfully, the important thing is that Lady Pemberton is escalating. If she has indeed made contact with someone from that night, someone who can provide damaging testimony, we need to find out who and what they claim to know. I showed him the vial Madame Volkoff had given me. She believes I may have forgotten something important about that night. She suggested I take this, that it might help me remember in dreams. He took the vial from me, held it up to the lamplight, his expression skeptical. You cannot seriously be considering drinking a potion given to you by a woman who makes her living deceiving people. What if she is right? I asked. What if there is something I have forgotten, something that could help us understand what Lady Pemberton is really after? Or what if this is poison, designed to silence you permanently? Then you should probably not let me drink it, I said with a small, tired smile. He set the vial down on his desk with more force than necessary. This is not amusing, Clara. You are taking absurd risks, meeting with dangerous people, considering consuming unknown substances. I feel as if I am watching you slip further and further from my reach, and I do not know how to protect you. I crossed to him, took his hands in mine. I am not slipping away. I am fighting. I am trying to find the truth before Lady Pemberton can bury it under lies. And yes, perhaps I am taking risks, but what choice do I have? We cannot simply wait for her to destroy us. He pulled me into his arms, held me tightly. I am afraid of losing you, he whispered against my hair. Not to scandal or social ruin, but to this darkness that seems to be closing in around us. I am afraid that one day you will walk out that door and not come back. I will always come back to you. I promised. No matter what happens, no matter what truths come to light, I will always find my way back to you. It was a promise I desperately wanted to keep, but even as I spoke the words, I felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on me. That night, after we had retired to our chambers and the Duke had fallen into restless sleep beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about the vial on his desk downstairs. I wanted to dismiss Madame Volkoff's suggestion as nonsense, but I could not shake the feeling that she might be right, that there was something buried in my memory, some detail I had overlooked or deliberately forgotten. I rose quietly, careful not to wake my husband, and padded barefoot through the dark house to his study. The vial sat where he had left it, innocuous and yet full of promise and threat. I held it in my palm, weighing my options. If it was truly just herbs, if it could help me remember, then perhaps it was worth the risk. And if it was something more sinister, well, at least the uncertainty would end. I uncorked the vial and drank it in one quick swallow. The liquid was bitter and thick, coating my tongue and throat, and for a moment I felt a surge of panic, wondering what I had just done. But then a warmth spread through me, a drowsiness that felt natural and unthreatening, and I made my way back to bed before it could pull me under. I dreamed. I was 16 again, standing in my uncle's surgery in the small hours of the night. The man on the table was bleeding, his breath coming in short, pained gasps, and my uncle was working frantically to stop the hemorrhaging. I held bandages as I had done so many times before, watching my uncle's skilled hands move with precision and urgency. But this time, there was something different about the dream, a clarity that I had never experienced before. I could see details I had forgotten, could hear conversations that had faded from memory. There were 3 men in the room besides the patient and my uncle. They had brought their wounded companion, demanding that the doctor save him, and they stood against the wall watching with hostile eyes. I remembered being frightened of them, of their rough clothes and rougher manners, of the way they looked at me with a mixture of contempt and something worse. One of them was speaking, his voice low but audible. "If he dies, the old man will answer for it, and the girl too. We know where they live. We know where to find them." My uncle had heard, I realized with sudden clarity. He had heard the threats, and his hands had trembled just slightly as he worked. And I had seen something in his face then, something I had not understood at 16, but recognized now with the wisdom of years and experience. Fear. Not just fear for his own safety, but fear of what he might have to do to protect us both. The patient gasped, convulsed. My uncle worked harder, faster, but it was too late. The man died as the clock struck midnight, his last breath rattling out of him like a curse. And then, in the dream, something happened that I did not remember from waking life. One of the men stepped forward, the one who had been making threats, and he looked down at his dead companion with an expression that was not grief, but satisfaction. "Good," he said quietly, so quietly that I almost missed it. "That's done then." My uncle had looked up sharply. "What did you say?" "Nothing, doctor. Just grieving." But there was a smile on his face, cold and calculating, and I understood in that moment of dream clarity what I had been too young and too frightened to understand then. They had wanted him dead. The men who brought him to my uncle's surgery, they had not wanted him saved. They had wanted him to die, and they had wanted a witness to blame for it. I woke gasping, the revelation crashing over me like a wave. The room was still dark, but the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky. The Duke stirred beside me, reached for me instinctively. "Clara? What is it?" "I remembered," I whispered. I remembered something about that night, something I had forgotten or suppressed or simply been too young to understand. I told him about the dream, about the man's words and his expression, about the terrible understanding that had come to me. If I was right, if the dream was truly a recovered memory and not just fantasy, then John Garrett's death had not been a tragedy at all. It had been planned, or at least welcomed, by the very men who had pretended to want him saved. But why? The Duke asked, fully awake now. Why would they want their own companion dead? I do not know, I admitted. But if we can find out, if we can prove that they had reason to want him gone, then we can demonstrate that my uncle's treatment was irrelevant, that Garrett was doomed regardless of what medical care he received. The Duke was already rising from bed, reaching for his dressing gown. "We need to contact Carlisle immediately. If your memory is accurate, if we can find evidence to support it, this changes everything. It means Lady Pemberton's witnesses are not just unreliable, they are actively complicit in whatever happened that night." But even as hope began to kindle in my chest, a darker thought occurred to me. If those men had wanted Garrett dead, if they had used my uncle's surgery as a convenient place to let him die with someone else to blame, then they had even more reason to want me silenced, because I had been there, I had seen their faces, heard their voices. I was a witness to whatever conspiracy had played out that night. And if Lady Pemberton had found them, if she had made contact with those same men, then she had unwittingly armed them with the perfect opportunity to eliminate me once and for all. The Duke saw the fear in my face and pulled me close. "We will protect you," he said firmly. "Now that we know what we are facing, we can take precautions. You will not go anywhere alone. We will have guards. We will keep you safe." But I was not sure safety was possible anymore. The ghosts of the past were not content to remain buried, and the living enemies I had made were determined to see me destroyed. The question was no longer whether the storm would come, but whether we would survive it when it did. As the sun rose over London, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I stood at the window of our chamber and watched the city wake. Somewhere out there, Lady Pemberton was plotting her next move. Somewhere out there, the men who had wanted John Garrett dead were waiting to see what I would do with my recovered memory. And somewhere, in the spaces between the living and the dead, perhaps a spirit truly was watching, waiting to see if justice would finally be served, or if the truth would remain forever buried under lies and fear. I did not know which outcome I feared more. Mr. Carlyle arrived within hours, and by noon we had reconstructed the truth. John Garrett had not died from incompetence. He had been murdered by his own companions, men who brought him to my uncle's surgery, knowing he would die, planning to blame the doctor so no one would investigate the real crime. My recovered memory had revealed what I had been too young to understand that night. The men who threatened us had wanted Garrett dead. But why? The answer came 3 days later, when the Duke's investigators uncovered Lady Pemberton's deepest secret. She had a brother, Thomas Garrett, who had vanished into London's criminal underworld years ago. The dead man, John Garrett, had been his accomplice in a smuggling ring operating from the docks. He had been preparing to turn informant, and Thomas Garrett had silenced him permanently. Lady Pemberton had orchestrated everything, the séance, the accusations, the campaign to destroy me, not from jealousy but from desperate necessity. If the truth about John Garrett's murder came to light, her brother would hang, and she would lose the criminal profits that had been keeping her afloat despite her crushing debts. She had been willing to sacrifice me, my uncle, even the Duke's reputation, to protect her brother and her precarious position in society. "We are going on the offensive," the Duke said, his voice cold with determination. "We will expose her before she can destroy us." My uncle came to Ashford Hall and gave his testimony. He confirmed everything I had remembered and revealed the years of intimidation he had endured, the threats that had kept him silent while I lived in hiding. His courage in finally speaking gave Mr. Carlyle the evidence needed to approach the authorities. But Lady Pemberton made her final move before we could act. She invited us to her townhouse, and there, in her elegant drawing room, she revealed her hand with chilling confidence. "I have witnesses prepared to testify against your wife and her uncle," she said, her smile sharp as glass. "Unless you annul this absurd marriage and court me as you should have from the beginning, I will see her charged with criminal negligence in a man's death." The Duke's response was immediate and devastating. "You are correct that I am a man of my class," he said quietly. "But you have misunderstood what that means. I am a man who honors his vows, who protects those under his care. I would sooner lose every title I possess than betray the woman I love to satisfy your schemes." Then he delivered the blow that shattered her composure. "We know about your brother Thomas. We know he murdered John Garrett to keep him from turning informant. We know you have been protecting him, benefiting from his criminal enterprises while maintaining your respectable facade. And we have the testimony to prove it." Lady Pemberton's face went white. "You cannot prove anything." "But Mr. Carlyle entered then with a police inspector, and her world crumbled. She was led away in disgrace, charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy to conceal murder. Her brother and his associates were arrested within days. The scandal that followed was intense, but brief. The newspapers focused on the criminals and their conspiracies rather than on the governess who had witnessed their crime. Society's opinion shifted as the truth emerged. What had been seen as shameful deception became instead a story of survival, of a young woman who had fled in terror and a duke who had chosen love over convention. 2 weeks after Lady Pemberton's arrest, I stood in a Whitechapel cemetery beside John Garrett's grave. My uncle and the Duke flanked me as I laid flowers on the headstone. "I never knew you," I said softly to the spirit that might still linger. "But you deserved better than to be murdered by those you trusted. I am sorry it took so long for justice to find you. I hope you have found peace." The wind stirred the bare branches overhead, and I felt something shift in the air, a sense of acknowledgement and release. Then it passed, leaving only quiet. In the months that followed, we rebuilt our lives on a foundation of truth rather than secrets. The Dowager Duchess gradually thawed, conceding that perhaps the family had weathered worse scandals. Lady Constance adjusted with a child's resilience, delighted to call me aunt. Invitations began arriving again, tentative at first, then with growing acceptance. But the most important healing happened in the quiet moments with my husband. We learned to speak with complete honesty, to share our fears and doubts without pretense. We learned that love is not a single moment of choosing, but a daily decision to stay, to fight, to forgive, to grow together through whatever storms might come. On a spring morning 6 months later, I woke to find the Duke at the window, watching the gardens come back to life after the long winter. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked quietly, joining him. "Marrying me, fighting for me, risking everything?" He pulled me close, his eyes full of warmth. "Never," he said. "You are the best decision I have ever made, Clara, or Eliza, or whoever you choose to be. I love all of you, the girl you were and the woman you have become." I kissed him then, and felt the last shadows of fear and shame finally lift from my heart. I had been so many people in my life, had worn so many names and faces, had hidden so much of myself away. But with him, I could finally be whole, simply myself, without pretense or protection. My uncle continued his work in Whitechapel, and I visited often, sometimes bringing Lady Constance to learn about healing. He told me once that seeing me happy had given him redemption he had not thought possible. Madame Volkoff wrote that her disturbing dreams had ceased, that she felt a lightness she had not experienced since the séance, as if some burden had been lifted. She closed by saying that sometimes the spirits we think are haunting us are simply truths waiting to be acknowledged. That evening, we hosted our first large gathering since the scandal, a formal announcement to London society that we were done hiding, done apologizing. As the first guests arrived and the house filled with light and laughter, I realized I was no longer afraid. Not of being discovered, not of being judged, not of losing everything I had built, because I had already survived the worst and had come through it with my love intact and my dignity restored. I was Eliza Thorne who had fled into the night. I was Clara Whitmore who had built a new life from nothing. I was the Duchess of Ashford who had earned her place through trial and suffering. I was all of these women, and none of them, and I was finally at peace with whoever I chose to be. The Duke leaned close to whisper in my ear, "I love you." "I love you too," I replied, meaning it with every part of my complicated, scarred, triumphant heart. The séance had revealed my true face, had torn away the mask I had worn for protection. But in doing so, it had freed me to become someone new, someone stronger, someone capable of love and trust and forgiveness. The spirits, if they had truly been present that night, had given me an unexpected gift, the chance to stop running, to face my past, and to build a future on a foundation of truth. And as I stood beside my husband greeting our guests, I silently thanked those forces, supernatural or not, that had set me on this path. For though the journey had been painful and frightening, it had led me home at last. Home to a man who loved me. Home to a family that had learned to accept me. Home to a life I no longer had to hide from or apologize for. Home to myself, complete and whole and finally, irrevocably free. The candles burned bright in the drawing room of Ashford Hall, and in their gentle light I could see only promise, only the future that stretched before us full of possibility and hope. The shadows of the past were behind me now, and I walked forward with my head high and my heart full, no longer afraid. I had been tested by fire and spirit and the cruelty of those who sought my destruction, and I had emerged not broken but transformed, to have survived. To have loved, to have become, at long last, exactly who I was always meant to be.